The morning Eleanor Hayes turned 69, her husband left her. There was no shouting, no dramatic argument, just a quiet sentence spoken across the kitchen table. "I can't do this anymore." 42 years of marriage ended with those 5 words. Eleanor sat very still while her husband Robert Hayes finished his coffee like he was discussing the weather. Outside, the quiet suburban street looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Children waited for the school bus. A neighbor watered her flowers. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the houses. Everything looked normal. Except Eleanor's life had just cracked open. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. Robert avoided her eyes. "It means I'm leaving." The sentence landed heavily in the small kitchen. Eleanor stared at the man she had spent most of her life beside. They met when she was 27. Robert had been charming then, ambitious, full of plans about the future they would build together. They bought their first home in a quiet suburb outside Cleveland, raised 2 children, worked hard, saved carefully, built a life that looked stable from the outside. But somewhere along the way, something between them slowly disappeared. Not suddenly, not violently, just quietly, like a light fading at the end of a long hallway. Robert finally stood up from the table. "There's someone else." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. She had already guessed. People who leave after 40 years rarely do it without a reason. "How long?" she asked. Robert hesitated. "A year." The answer felt strangely calm. After 4 decades of marriage, even betrayal arrived quietly. "What happens now?" she asked. Robert picked up his car keys. "I've already moved my things." Eleanor blinked. "When?" "Last week." For the first time that morning, she felt something sharp in her chest, not anger, just realization. Her husband had been planning his exit while they were still sharing breakfast every morning. Robert walked toward the front door. He paused for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, but the apology sounded distant, almost routine. Then he left. The door closed softly behind him, and Eleanor Hayes was alone. The house felt unusually quiet. For decades, the small suburban home had been filled with the ordinary sounds of family life, children running down hallways, television playing in the living room, Robert talking on the phone about work. Now there was only silence. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for a long time. At 69 years old, most people expected life to become smaller, quieter, predictable, not start over from the beginning. 3 weeks later, the divorce papers arrived. Robert had already arranged everything. The house would be sold, the savings divided, and Eleanor would receive a modest settlement. Just enough to live carefully, but not enough to rebuild the life she once had. So Eleanor made a decision. She packed 2 suitcases, loaded them into her old car, and drove 3 hours south. Back to the place she hadn't seen in decades, the house she grew up in, the small suburban home her parents had left to her years earlier. When Eleanor finally arrived, the neighborhood looked almost unchanged. The same quiet streets, the same maple trees lining the sidewalks, the same small houses built in the 1960s. Her parents' house stood at the end of the block, a modest brick home with white shutters and a narrow front porch. Dust covered the windows. The lawn had grown uneven, but the structure still stood strong. Eleanor stepped out of the car slowly. For a moment, she simply stared at the house. This was the place where her life had started. And now, somehow, it was where she had returned after losing everything. The front door creaked softly when she unlocked it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old wood and forgotten memories. Sunlight filtered through the dusty curtains. Furniture remained exactly where her parents had left it years earlier. Eleanor walked slowly through the living room. Every step echoed softly. It felt like stepping back into another life. She placed her suitcase near the staircase and looked around. At 69 years old, she was starting over, in the same house where she had once dreamed about the future. But something strange happened that first night. Just after midnight, Eleanor heard a sound outside, a car door closing. She frowned. The neighborhood had always been quiet, especially this late. Eleanor walked toward the living room window and carefully pulled the curtain aside. A black pickup truck was parked across the street. The engine was off, but someone was sitting inside, watching the house. For a long moment, Eleanor stood there, staring into the darkness. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He walked slowly toward her driveway, and under the streetlight, Eleanor realized something that made her heart skip. She knew that face, because the man walking toward her childhood home was someone she hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. And his sudden appearance would change everything about the life she thought was over. Eleanor Hayes stood very still beside the living room window. Outside, the quiet suburban street looked almost unreal under the dim glow of the streetlight. The black pickup truck remained parked across from the house, and the man who had stepped out of it was now walking slowly toward her driveway. Her heart beat a little faster. At first she thought she might be mistaken. 40 years is a long time, faces change, hair turns gray, posture shifts. But as the man stepped closer to the light, Eleanor felt a strange certainty settle inside her. She knew him, even after all these years. The man stopped at the edge of her driveway and looked toward the house as if making sure he had the right place. Then he walked a few steps closer to the porch. Eleanor hesitated. Part of her wanted to stay hidden behind the curtain and pretend she hadn't seen him. But something deeper, something curious and unresolved, pushed her forward. She opened the front door slowly. The night air was cool and quiet. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man looked up immediately. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then a small, surprised smile appeared on his face. "Eleanor," the sound of her name in his voice made the years disappear instantly. "Michael," she said. The man standing in the driveway nodded. Michael Turner, her first love, the boy she had once believed she might marry, the boy who had disappeared from her life almost overnight when she was 28. For several seconds they simply stared at each other. Neither seemed quite sure what to say next. "I wasn't sure it was you," Michael admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "When I heard someone moved back into this house, I had to come see." Eleanor stepped down from the porch. "I didn't expect to see anyone I knew here." Michael glanced at the house again. "You came back?" "Yes." The simple answer carried years of quiet history behind it. Michael shifted his weight slightly as if deciding how much to say. "I moved back a few months ago," he explained. "My sister owns the house down the street now." Eleanor looked surprised. "You're living here again," Michael nodded. "After a long time away." There was a pause. "So what brought you back?" he asked gently. Eleanor hesitated. She hadn't told anyone in this town about the divorce yet, but somehow standing there with Michael felt different. "Robert left," she said simply. Michael's expression changed. "I'm sorry." Eleanor shrugged slightly. "It happens." Michael studied her face carefully. Even after 40 years, he could still read the emotions she tried to hide. "You deserve better than that," he said quietly. Eleanor looked down at the gravel driveway. "You don't know the whole story?" Michael smiled faintly. "Maybe not." He paused. "But I remember you." The words hung softly in the night air. Eleanor felt something unexpected move through her chest, a memory. A feeling she hadn't thought about in decades. "You disappeared," she said suddenly. Michael blinked. "What?" "When we were younger," Eleanor continued. "You just left town, no explanation, no goodbye." Michael's expression grew serious. "That wasn't how it happened." Eleanor looked up at him. "What do you mean?" Michael hesitated before answering. "I wrote to you." Her heart skipped. "What?" "3 letters," he said. "After I moved to Chicago." Eleanor stared at him. "I never received them." Michael frowned. "I sent them to this address." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No one ever told me." The realization hung between them. 40 years ago something had gone wrong, a message that never arrived. A goodbye that never happened. Michael looked toward the house again. "You waited for me?" he asked quietly. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. "Yes," she admitted after a moment. "Until I believed you had changed your mind." Michael exhaled slowly. "I thought you chose Robert." The silence between them suddenly felt heavy with lost years. 2 lives that had moved in different directions because of something neither of them had understood. Finally, Michael spoke again. "Well, it looks like we're both back here now." Eleanor gave a small smile. "Yes." Michael glanced toward his truck. "I should probably let you settle in." He turned to leave. But before he reached the vehicle, Eleanor spoke again. "Michael." He stopped. "Yes." She hesitated. Something about this unexpected reunion felt strangely important. "Why did you really come tonight?" Michael looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that made her heart pause. "Because when I heard Eleanor Hayes had moved back into this house," he smiled softly, "I realized I had waited 40 years to see you again." The quiet street seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time since Robert had walked out of her life, Eleanor felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. But she didn't know something yet. Because the past that had separated them 40 years ago was about to reveal a truth neither of them had ever discovered. And that truth would change everything about the life Eleanor thought was beginning again. The night air grew colder as Eleanor and Michael stood quietly in the driveway. Neither of them seemed ready to end the conversation. 40 years is a long time for two people to carry unanswered questions. Eleanor looked toward the small brick house behind her, the house where she had grown up, the house where her parents had lived until the day they passed away. Suddenly, a thought crossed her mind. "Michael," she said slowly, "when exactly did you send those letters?" Michael leaned against his truck for a moment, thinking. "Late summer," he said, "the year I moved to Chicago. I wrote the first letter a few weeks after I arrived." Eleanor frowned slightly. "That was the same year my father got sick." Michael looked surprised. "I didn't know that." Eleanor nodded. "He had a stroke that fall. My mother was overwhelmed and I spent most of my time helping her." Michael thought for a moment. "Then maybe someone else collected the mail." The idea made Eleanor uneasy. "My mother always checked the mailbox," she said. Michael tilted his head slightly. "What about your father?" Eleanor hesitated. "My father," Michael nodded. "He and I didn't exactly get along back then." Eleanor remembered her father had always been strict, protective, suspicious of the young man who spent so much time with his daughter. "You think he took the letters?" she asked quietly. Michael gave a small shrug. "I don't know, but I know I sent them." The thought settled heavily in Eleanor's mind. For years she had believed Michael simply disappeared from her life, that he had changed his mind, that he had chosen another path. But now a different possibility existed. Michael studied her expression. "You're thinking about it too," he said. Eleanor nodded slowly. "My father never approved of you." Michael gave a small smile. "That's one way to describe it." Eleanor suddenly remembered something. "Wait here," she said. Before Michael could ask why, she walked quickly back toward the house. The front door creaked softly as she stepped inside. For several minutes the house was silent again. Michael remained beside his truck, watching the porch light glow through the trees. Then the door opened once more. Eleanor stepped outside holding a small wooden box. Michael recognized it immediately. "What's that?" "It belonged to my father," she said. Eleanor walked down the porch steps slowly. "When my parents passed away, I packed most of their things into storage. I haven't opened this box in years." She knelt beside the truck and placed the box on the hood. For a moment she hesitated. Then she lifted the lid. Inside were old photographs, documents, and several unopened envelopes tied together with a faded ribbon. Michael's heart skipped. Eleanor slowly untied the ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned over the first envelope. The handwriting on the front was familiar. Eleanor Hayes, and in the corner Michael Turner. For a moment neither of them spoke. The envelope had never been opened. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of emotions rushing through her chest. Shock, sadness, and something else. A quiet realization. "My father kept them," she whispered. Michael stared at the envelopes. 40 years, he said softly. Eleanor opened the first letter carefully. The paper inside had yellowed with time, but the words were still clear. "Eleanor, Chicago is bigger than I expected. I wish you were here to see it with me. I'll come back soon if you still want me to." Her eyes filled with tears. Michael looked away for a moment. "I waited months for a reply," he said quietly. "I thought you had changed your mind." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I thought you had forgotten me." The two of them stood there beneath the porch light, holding the evidence of a misunderstanding that had changed the course of both their lives. 40 years of silence, caused by 3 letters that never reached their destination. Finally, Michael looked at her again. "So, what happens now?" Eleanor closed the wooden box gently. For the first time since Robert had left her weeks earlier, she felt something completely different from grief, possibility. She looked at Michael and smiled. "I suppose we start with coffee," she said. Michael laughed softly. "After 40 years, that seems fair." They walked toward the porch together. The quiet suburban street looked exactly the same as it had earlier that evening, but everything about Eleanor's life had changed. Robert had left her. Her marriage had ended, and she had returned to the house where her story first began. But sometimes losing everything doesn't mean the end. Sometimes it clears the way for something that was meant to happen all along. As the door closed behind them, Eleanor realized something she hadn't expected at 69 years old. Life wasn't finished. In fact, it might finally be starting again.